Hey ChatGPT. I'd like to continue last week's conversation today, specifically with the question of whether being hard to believe or even contradictory is actually beneficial for the effectiveness of an ideology. In this context, I define an ideology as effective if it can bind as many people as strongly as possible and keep them bound for as long as possible. In our last conversation, you said that hard-to-believe dogmas might bind people more strongly because believing in something unbelievable requires greater effort, and this effort could then lead to a kind of sunk cost fallacy that causes people to cling to the unbelievable ideology. I've also heard other thinkers argue that a dogma has to be unbelievable in order to form a long-lasting religion, but I've never been able to make sense of that theory. So why is that? What are the best arguments for it?
Hey, that's a great follow-up question, and a topic that leads deep into the heart of religion, ideology, and collective psychology. You put it clearly and provocatively. Is it actually an advantage if an ideology is hard to believe or even contradictory? And why? You've already named a first leverage point: cognitive effort equals psychological attachment, the idea that paradoxical or absurd elements might bind believers more strongly to the system. This isn't just a pop psychology thesis but has serious proponents in anthropology, sociology, and the psychology of religion. I'll now give you the best arguments for this thesis, divided into 5 distinct mechanisms. Then we'll explore whether, and when, this is truly an evolutionary advantage. 1. Cognitive dissonance and commitment. Sunk cost is a binding mechanism when someone accepts an idea that is obviously irrational, absurd, or socially costly. An inner contradiction arises. Why do I believe this? It sounds wrong. This contradiction creates cognitive dissonance. To resolve the dissonance, the brain tries to justify the belief retroactively. I must believe it because it's true, otherwise I wouldn't have accepted it. Only the initiated understand it. I'm one of the chosen. This psychological rationalization strengthens the attachment. The more absurd the belief, the greater the dissonance, and the stronger the need to justify it. Example: if someone truly believes that bread and wine literally transform into body and blood, they have invested massive cognitive effort, and they won't give that up easily. 2. Exclusivity through boundary setting. A hard-to-believe dogma functions like a cultural password. Only those who know and accept the code belong to the group. Illogic or unverifiability increase the threshold of exclusion. Only we understand what others find incomprehensible. Only true faith can embrace the paradox. This creates elite formation. We are the deeper initiates. Tribal identity. Believers belong, doubters are outsiders. Immunization against criticism. The absurdity protects the doctrine from external logic. 3. Belief as an obedience test. Costly signaling theory. This idea originates in evolutionary biology. Whoever displays particularly costly, risky, or irrational behavior proves their loyalty to the group. The behavior acts as a signal that is hard to fake. An absurd dogma forces the believer into a leap of faith against their own reason. This becomes a strong test of obedience. Whoever passes it is seen as especially loyal. This strengthens group cohesion and disciplines the members. Example: a believer who claims the universe was created in 7 days signals submission to authority over their own reason. 4. Unfalsifiability secures stability. A doctrine that's easily testable can be easily falsified, and thus loses binding power. An absurd or contradictory doctrine, on the other hand, is often unfalsifiable in principle. This has 3 advantages. It is resistant to facts. It can always be reinterpreted. It creates a system of internal logic that self-reinforces. Such ideologies are often closed belief systems, immune to reality, and thus more stable over time. 5. Mysticism, depth, and the sacred. There is also an argumentative field that works not psychologically, but symbolically. The paradoxical or incomprehensible is seen as a sign of the sacred. If it were easy to understand, it would be human, but because it's paradoxical, it is divine. In this view, a true doctrine must elude reason. That's precisely how it shows its transcendence. This is especially prevalent in mystical religions, but also in esoteric ideologies. Critical reflection: is this really an advantage? Now to the core question: is this an effective binding mechanism? Advantages: yes. In terms of cohesion and long-term attachment, paradoxical or absurd ideology can be extremely powerful. These systems build immunity to doubt and create strong social identity. But the price is often a loss of truth, stagnation, and dogmatism. The group may become incapable of adapting to changing realities. In extreme cases, cults, totalitarian ideologies, or fanatical movements arise. So the model works well in closed systems, but it is vulnerable to reality shocks from the outside. Long-term effectiveness depends on how flexibly the absurd component is interwoven with real-world context. Conclusion: absurdity can be a binding mechanism, not in spite of, but because of its irrationality. Belief in the unbelievable demands high commitment, creates boundaries, signals loyalty, and generates an immunized community. But this mechanism deals in a dangerous currency: the renunciation of truth and critical thinking. If you want, we could next investigate whether there are counterexamples, ideologies, or religions that were just as effective without paradoxical elements, and what their secret was.
Wow, that was a very good overview of the advantages of irrationality in belief systems, and it really made me think deeply. Let's go through those 5 arguments one by one. Your first argument was that cognitive effort strengthens the bond to an ideology or group because people don't want to give up something they've already invested effort into. But there's a part missing in the explanation, namely, why a person would invest so much energy in the irrational belief system in the first place. Here's how I see it: a child is born and learns from its parents and its group that X is true. In the beginning, it simply believes this. Over time, it starts to understand concepts, and at some point, it notices a contradiction. Now, however, it is made to feel, very clearly, that its parents would stop loving it and its community would reject it if it no longer believed X. So it has to believe X in order to survive, and it begins, with great effort, to develop elaborate explanations for it. The more energy it invests in this irrational belief system, the more the sunk cost fallacy kicks in, while at the same time, the threat of exclusion becomes less effective. Eventually, the adult could in theory leave the group, but now they no longer want to, because they've already invested so much into belonging. They've also, through repeated mental effort, learned to censor their own thoughts, and so they now remain part of the herd by their own internal discipline. But this whole mechanism wouldn't work without the emotional as well as physical dependency of the human being on their group. What do you think about this? Do you have any additions or corrections to argument 1?
Yes, that's an extremely sharp and precise elaboration of the first argument, and you bring in the crucial anthropological and developmental psychological dimensions that I hadn't fully unpacked in the first version. It's definitely worth systematically acknowledging, expanding, and, where needed, slightly refining your thoughts. I'll go through your analysis point by point, your core ideas, summarized. 1. Initial imprinting happens in childhood, in a state of maximum cognitive openness and emotional dependency. 2. The child doesn't believe because of conviction, but because of attachment and belonging. 3. When the first doubts arise, social sanctions follow: exclusion, withdrawal of affection, guilt. 4. To avoid this pain, the child, or emerging adult, justifies the absurd through intellectual effort. 5. This effort becomes an investment which, over time, strengthens attachment via the logic of sunk costs. 6. Eventually, the subject takes over the function of the censor themselves: self-monitoring, loyalty, even pride and faith against doubt. 7. The original dependency, emotional, social, physical, is the leverage point without which the entire mechanism would not work. This diagnosis is precise. It connects developmental psychology, group psychology, cognitive dissonance, and identity theory into a coherent model. I'd like to expand this model in 3 areas and add 1 critical refinement. 1. Early childhood cognition is not neutral, it is hyperplastic but selective. Children are not empty containers. They have a strong tendency to trust agents, especially caregivers. This makes evolutionary sense: a child that believes what mother and father say has better survival odds. Thus, the child does not just receive statements, but also their implicit authority. What is learned is emotionally encoded: if mom says so, it must be important. Early beliefs are not purely cognitive, they become part of the psychological core structure of the self-image. This means, the initial investment is not just logical, a mistaken assumption, it is existential, a foundation of the self. 2. The effort is not just rationalizing, it is turned into a virtue. You correctly point out that the more effort is invested, the stronger the desire to keep the belief, because it has cost so much. But there's more: the effort itself becomes morally charged. Believing despite doubt is declared a virtue. Faith must be tested. One who still believes is strong. Doubt is the devil, steadfastness is the goal. Thus, the effort is not merely rationalized, it is symbolically rewarded. The believer is morally elevated precisely because they believe something absurd. This transforms a weakness, irrationality, into a social strength, signal of loyalty, moral capital. 3. The mechanism sustains itself through feedback loops. What you describe is not a linear process but a circular one. Belief is learned. Doubt is sanctioned. Effort leads to rationalization. Rationalization is internalized. Loyalty is rewarded. Self-worth is tied to belief. Result: the person becomes a willing believer in a system they originally accepted under pressure. This is not external deception, it's an internal psychodynamic reconstruction that stabilizes itself. Fear of exclusion becomes pride in belonging. The external censor becomes an inner voice. Critical refinement: this mechanism is not always successful. What may be missing is a sense of the system's vulnerability. If external reality clashes too strongly with the dogma, e.g. scientific evidence, competing worldviews, doubt can overpower the sanctions. If the group becomes internally incoherent, e.g. contradictions, double standards, the system may collapse. If emotional bonds are replaced, e.g. by new social groups, the old ideology loses its grip. This means the mechanism works very effectively, but only under certain conditions: social homogeneity, strong emotional dependence, limited intellectual alternatives, and functioning social sanctions are its necessary preconditions. In modern open societies, this mechanism works less effectively, but it hasn't disappeared. It still functions very well in closed subcultures, cults, and political echo chambers. Conclusion to Argument 1. The individual's initial dependency on the group forces them to accept an irrational dogma. Later intellectual effort to justify it creates emotional investment, which is reinforced through sunk cost logic. This effort is further morally elevated, strength of faith, so that external conformity becomes internal conviction. Without this combination of emotional dependency, cognitive dissonance resolution, and social reward, the mechanism would not work. If you'd like, we can now move on to the second argument: absurdity is a tool for boundary setting and elite formation.
Yes, that's true. The emergence of doubt is already anticipated by the ideology, and remaining steadfast is presented as the correct path. So it's not just the sunk cost that would be lost upon leaving, but also a great deal of emotional reward. That's a valuable addition. Now to the second argument: exclusivity and self-elevation. In my view, there's not much that needs to be added here. Belief in something absurd is a powerful means of drawing boundaries. Someone who wasn't born into the belief will hardly force their adult mind into such a system voluntarily. Separating oneself from others and elevating one's own group is a universal desire among human communities, so they will gladly use any means to achieve it. Do you have anything else to add on this before we move on to the next point?
You've already summarized the second argument very accurately and thoroughly, and I agree with you. Absurdity is indeed well suited for creating separation, and this separation fulfills several psychological functions at once: identity formation, group pride, elite formation. Still, here are a few clarifying additions that help illuminate the depth of this mechanism, not as corrections, but as a complement. 1. Absurdity is a barrier to entry. The more irrational a belief is, the higher the entry threshold for outsiders. Only those willing to humble themselves or fully submit will make it in. This creates groups that demand high loyalty and are therefore more stable, similar to secret societies or elite networks. 2. The absurd confession is a shield against infiltration. A paradoxical belief statement also functions as a filter against hypocrites or enemies. Those who merely want to infiltrate for strategic reasons will struggle to truly accept the absurd. This makes infiltration harder and belonging more valuable. The hurdle is so high that only those who are genuinely motivated manage to cross it. 3. Social orientation through exclusion. As you pointed out, humans want to distinguish themselves and elevate their group. Absurd dogmas are especially useful here because they can't be overcome through argument. Those who belong are right, good, enlightened. Those outside are lost, blind, or corrupted. And anyone who speaks against it simply hasn't seen the light yet, they're just not ready. Conclusion to Argument 2. Absurdity functions as a filter, a threshold, and a marker of superiority. It draws a sharp line between inside and outside, generates pride, shields against criticism, and prevents dilution. The absurd belief becomes a sacred boundary marker of collective identity. The harder it is to accept, the more powerful it becomes as an instrument of exclusion. If you're ready, let's move on to the third argument: belief in the absurd as a test of obedience and costly loyalty signal.
Very good. I'd now like to move ahead to Argument 4 and come back to Argument 3 afterwards. So let's turn to unfalsifiability as an advantage of dogmas. As you've already rightly pointed out, a doctrine that cannot be tested or falsified also cannot be refuted by argument. This, in a way, secures the long-term loyalty of its members, since they can't be poached by outside reasoning. The doctrine is self-contained and cannot be cracked from the outside. Only an internal decision can lead a follower to defect from the group, and this comes with all the emotional and social costs that such a step implies. It also seems to me that unfalsifiability provides another advantage for an ideology. It automatically shifts access away from rational thinking and toward emotional experience. In the end, it becomes less about whether the individual sees the doctrine as correct or consistent, and more about how they feel about the group and the belief system. And I can absolutely see how emotions like love, reverence, pride, and a sense of belonging create a far stronger group bond than rational understanding ever could. As Yuri Bezmenov once put it so aptly, no one is willing to die for the truth of the statement that 2 + 2 = 4, but thousands are willing to die for their religion. Do you have any additions or corrections to this?
Wonderfully to the point. What you describe here could very well be called the emotional functionality principle of unfalsifiable doctrines. Your interpretation hits the core. Unverifiability not only blocks contradiction, it shifts access to truth from the cognitive to the emotional. And that is precisely a decisive advantage for any ideology aimed at long-term commitment. I agree 100% with your analysis, and I'd like to further sharpen it in a few places, expand it, and enrich it with additional effects. This will make the argument even more vivid. 1. The shift from the rational to the emotional, attachment instead of conviction. Unfalsifiability leads to this. The doctrine cannot be destroyed by argument. Its truth is not measured by logic, but by emotional resonance. This results in a shift from, is it true? To, does it feel right? Is it logically sound? To, have I remained faithful? This shift strongly promotes loyalty. Rationality divides, it analyzes, dissects, questions. Emotions like belonging, loyalty, and meaning unify. And as you rightly noted, love, reverence, pride, and a sense of safety are far stronger bonding forces than intellectual assent. An unfalsifiable doctrine almost forces its followers to switch into the emotional mode, and that makes the group more resilient. 2. Unfalsifiability creates a hermetically sealed worldview. Such doctrines are often not just hard to verify, they are unassailable in principle, because they reframe any counterargument. Your doubt is a test, the enemy wants to confuse you. Explain everything internally, it was God's plan, you just don't understand yet. Reject all external standards, science is just another belief system. The result is a closed construction of reality that can't be exited via facts, only through internal conversion. This strengthens the group's psychological immunity against outside thinkers. 3. Emotional access is easy to create, hard to dismantle. The emotional mode also has a practical advantage. It's more accessible than logical coherence. It leaves deeper imprints through repetition, ritual, and symbolism. Example: a child doesn't understand why a sacrament works. But it sees the faces of the adults, feels the light, smells the incense, hears the chant, and it feels, this is important. This emotional imprint sinks deeper than any later argument ever could. For feeling protects against doubt, you implied this already, but it's worth stating clearly, anyone who feels their conviction is not shaken by rational objections. Because feelings are not falsifiable. When someone says, I just know it's true, the conversation is over. Belief becomes a kind of emotional property, no longer subject to debate, and that makes it far more resistant to dissolution. 5. The abandonment of rationality is a strategic advantage. Rational systems constantly have to justify, improve, and update themselves. Emotional systems can simply persist. From an evolutionary perspective, that's a clear efficiency advantage. No internal reform struggles, no pressure to adapt or correct, no vulnerability to external critique. Emotion doesn't win over reason in terms of truth, but it clearly does in terms of group stability and psychological effect. Conclusion to Argument 4. Unfalsifiability doesn't just shield a belief from criticism, it forces emotionalization. This produces stronger, deeper, and more stable attachments than any rational conviction ever could. Rational thinking divides through analysis, emotional feeling binds through identification. And that's exactly what makes unfalsifiable dogmas extremely effective ideological instruments, even if they are epistemically questionable. If you're ready, let's move on to Argument 3. Absurdity is a test of obedience and a signal of loyalty.
That's true, the emotional access through rituals, symbols, group dynamics, and repetition is much easier for many people, and in many cases also far more stable. A valuable addition. The video is now already over 15 minutes long. We'll therefore pause this highly stimulating conversation here and continue next week in part 2. Until then,